Chapter 9 Alms Rounds A Beggar in the Wilderness. Big gestures get applause. Small ones change people. Guess which one Buddha would have upvoted? We were now fully ordained monks in the Dhammakaya order, and everything shifted. Some things subtly, others like the earth tilting a few degrees on its axis. Our interactions with our teachers changed, imperceptibly at first. The tone softened into mutual regard. The distance shortened. Where once there had been gentle guidance from above, there was now a back and forth, a give and take. The bows remained. Monks bowed to each other all the time. But so did a sense that we had stepped through a doorway into a different kind of brotherhood. One built on shared vows, robes, shared insight, and silent moments that screamed loudly. But the biggest change for me came with the knowledge that we would soon go on alms rounds, dana, in the mountain villages beyond our monastery grounds. Not through tidy streets with designated paths like city monks where food is gifted as predictably as the sunrise. No, we would walk into the remote highlands, places so far flung that some were nothing more than rumors hidden among rocky folds of mist and memory. Among my newly ordained brothers, this practice stirred something uneasy. We spoke in low tones about under the pomelo and teak trees, our saffron robes brushing dust as we paced and pondered. The idea of becoming beggars, because that is what the Pali word for monk truly means, left many of us uneasy, some even ashamed at the next step. We had grown up in lives where food came easy, where need was theoretical. We were the givers of canned goods and charitable checks, not the ones with open hands. Now we were to walk into the lives of people who had so little, and as wordlessly, for more. To take rice from the hands of those who lived day by day, hand to mouth, felt backwards, morally crooked. It cut against everything we'd been taught to admire in ourselves: independence, contribution, the quiet nobility of not needing anything. Some of us tried to reason our way through it. Maybe this was theater. Maybe the villagers did it out of habit or obligation. Maybe they didn't really miss the food we took. After all, hadn't we eaten more than our share at the monastery already? Meals abundant, meticulously prepared, never once lacking. Still, I couldn't shake the question. What right did I have to ask for more from those who already had so little? It was a deep philosophical reckoning, one we revisited often in our debates. None of us had ever begged for food, not once. That thought alone ran against everything we'd been taught to admire: self sufficiency, contribution, control. To stand in front of another human being with an empty bowl and expect sustenance from their hands. It felt almost indecent. We didn't understand the impulse to give when one had so little to spare. It unsettled many of us. Perhaps you've seen images: monks walking silently in single file at dawn, heads bowed in humility, feet bare, saffron robes fluttering faintly in the morning breeze. They move like smoke, quiet, steady, reverent, toward villagers who kneel or sit, waiting with rice, stews, bundles of noodles, fresh fruits, and water. You see these images and think peace, grace, harmony. I saw them and felt a kind of dread. It stuck in my craw like a bad dream, being the receiver in a world where I'd always been the one offering. I didn't feel worthy of that kind of generosity. More than that, I didn't feel it was necessary. These were people with little, feeding those of us who, truth be told, had so much already. Our meals at the monastery had been abundant, plentiful, sometimes even excessive. We'd never gone without. How could I, in good conscience, hold out my bowl? What we hadn't yet grasped was the root of their giving. Despite our long debates and sincere efforts to understand both sides of the alms ritual, we were still missing something essential. Why give when it hurts to do so? Why offer up what might be needed for one's own child or aging parent? Only later would I put two and two together and begin to understand that the food we received came not from surplus, but from sacrifice, and that this, perhaps, was the point. Our monastery was fed not only by local farmers, many of whom grew crops expressly for us, but also by donors from across Thailand and beyond. Some were former monks from our program, returned to the world but still tethered by memory and gratitude. Others gave anonymously, shipment of food and funds. And it wasn't just for us. That abundance, so generously offered, often became surplus. Surplus that allowed the monastery to extend its own alms outward, to struggling schools, to village clinics, to families in need. There was an interlinked ecosystem at play, a circle of giving where nobody held on to what they could pass along. And I had to ask myself, was I really at the bottom of that circle? Or was I simply unused to standing still and holding my hands open? Sometimes the offerings were meager and slim, other times astonishing in their generosity. I remember walking past the sorting tables near the kitchen, where enormous stacks of brand new fleece blankets lay folded in crisp rows, still carrying the scent of the factory. They had arrived as a single anonymous donation and were already being prepared for redonation to two mountain communities far beyond the last bend in the road, villages whose names didn't appear on maps. These were places so remote that the floods of September and October had stranded them in darkness for weeks, with no power, little clean water, and only the fading hope that someone might still be thinking of them. The blankets would bring not just warmth, but proof that the world hadn't forgotten about them. We, the newly minted monks, couldn't yet understand such acts of giving. We debated them in our hushed corners of reflection, trying to trace the motivations. Some suggested guilt, the karmic calculus of the privileged, paying spiritual dues with tangible gifts. Others believed it to be obligation dressed up as virtue. But none of those explanations fully accounted for the softness of those blankets, the thoughtfulness of their timing, or the way they would be carried, on foot, in silence, into villages more sky than road. That day would open up something in us. Slowly, and in different ways for each man, our understanding began to shift. What we thought we knew of generosity, of need, of giving and receiving, would melt and reshape itself. It wasn't about the food or the blankets or even the material exchange. It was about something far older and deeper than that, something quiet, humane, and universal. We were beginning to understand that compassion, true compassion, doesn't measure the cost. It gives because it must, because it can, because to withhold would wound something sacred. In that unfolding, we too were changed. Friday dawned cold, 39 degrees Fahrenheit and raining. Not a mist or a drizzle, but big, fat, unhurried raindrops that seemed to fall straight from the gut of the sky and go splat. It had only been 2 days since we'd taken our vows, formally entering the I Monastery fraternity as Luang Pi, brother monks in the Theravada tradition, and now we were to go on our first alms round. We would walk as real monks, honest to goodness, shaven headed, robed mendicants, into the folds of the high mountain villages that clung to the hills like moss to stone. It was still dark when we climbed into two Toyota pickups. The sky had just begun to smudge with light along the eastern ridge, dawn unspooling in threads. Our caravan crept slowly, quietly up toward a village we would receive food from those who, by all Western logic, could least afford to give it. Alms rounds are never random. They're not something you just throw together. These routes and visits are organized well in advance and negotiated between the elders of the monastery and those of each village. You don't just show up. 15 monks deep with bowls in hand, like door to door salesmen at sunrise, expecting a welcome committee and a pot of jasmine rice. Those urban alms routes do not exist in the rural highlands. There are no plastic stools, no tidy queues of merit seekers, no daily routes. The villagers needed notice. They must wake up early, cook rice, prepare stews, gather fruit, bag up little care packages of chips or cookies, and pour juice or water into bottles to give. And of course, no one village can support the full weight of 15 hungry monks every week. That kind of karmic enthusiasm would wipe out their pantries. Going forward, we'd be sent out in smaller groups 4 monks here, 4 monks there, sharing the load across the scattered hill communities. Alms are gifts, not obligations. There's no sense in showing up like a Buddhist locust swarm. Our first outing wasn't just about sustenance. Yes, we'd gather food for the communal tables back at I Monastery. But more than that, this was a lesson, a living, breathing tutorial in humility. A chance to see, for many of us, the first time in our lives what generosity actually looks like when it isn't performative or tax deductible. Being Bante, I was ordered, really, to ride inside the truck cab with the heat on, nestled behind the driver along with another monk on crutches and Luang P. Fop. The rest of my Sangha huddled under tarps in the bed of the trucks, shielding themselves from the wet and cold as best they could. I argued my position that I needed to be in the back with my Sangha, leadership by example. And I meant it. I wanted to be with my brothers, cold and wet and equally miserable. But Luang P. What, my teacher and friend, gave me a look, one that spoke volumes, immediately closing the argument as if slamming a book shut. We had been carefully robed for the day, dressed like textbook monks, every fold and pleat just so. But the chill was real, and so was my fleece beanie, my thick socks stuffed into Birkenstocks, and the blanket I had smuggled into the truck like a guilty pleasure. I bundled into them while I could, knowing the time would come to shed the layers, physical and metaphysical, and step outside into my role. I Monastery is tucked into a small valley in the Thanan Thong Chai Range, surrounded on all sides by mountains whose peaks snag clouds like prayer flags. We wound our way up muddy switchbacks, through mist and rain, to the village of Lochi, a place known for its highland rice and tea plantations. The road narrowed with each turn until it was hardly more than a ribbon of mud, wide enough for a truck and a dog to pass each other without an argument. Eventually, we reached the top of Lochi, where the village elder had arranged for us to begin. Our trucks rolled into the broad, flat driveway of an ancient, large teak wood house or barn. I couldn't determine what it was. The engines died, and a thick, blanketing silence fell like a curtain. It was time to take off my beanie. Time to fold the blanket, remove the socks and sandals. Time to stop being a comfort seeking Westerner and step into the quiet, ancient rhythm of the monk's walk, high up on the mountain. The first thing I noticed as I stepped down from the truck was that the air had changed. It was thicker up there, sweet and saturated, like the forest had exhaled something thick just for us. The chill was still there, but it carried less bite, softened somehow by mist and altitude. And then, of course, my feet landed directly in a puddle of muddy, cold mountain water. That, and the wet nose of a village dog introducing himself to my rear end, brought me back from any lofty thoughts. One of dozens, it turned out. The dogs kept close, shadowing our group like shaggy, silent sentinels. Not begging, not barking, just there, shadowing our every step. I figured it must be the robes vibe. We didn't feed them, we didn't pet them, but they followed anyway. Maybe they sensed we were trying to be decent. It was time. Time to cinch the invisible strap of monkish resolve, put on my metaphorical walking meditation hat, and forget the rain soaking my jiwan. I had taken vows. I wore the robes. Now I had to walk the walk. Each of us slung our pata across our shoulders. The large black orb nestled in its sling. That's when I noticed, taped securely to the lid in large type, was a printed blessing we were to recite in unison to each almsgiver. A divine cheat sheet. In the other hand, we held umbrellas. I managed to hang on to mine for exactly 2 holms before I surrendered it back to our driver. Hard to balance an umbrella when you're lifting a bowl while hanging onto the lid to accept generosity from someone you feel unworthy to even look in the eye. I gave in to the drizzle. Moments later, the rain eased to a gentle mist. I'd like to think the universe gave me a nod for letting go and let karma weave her spell. 17 of us, all newly minted monks with our senior monk guides at the lead, lined up by height through, though as Bante, I was placed right behind Luang P. Wat at the front of the line. Our feet found the steep, muddy slope of the village road, more like a wide trail carved into the ridge. The place looked like it had grown up from the earth rather than being built. Houses of slatted wood rose on stilts, balanced like nesting birds on the edge of steep terraces. Tawdry plastic sheets flapped softly where windows might have been, if there was plastic at all. Many window portals were open and uncovered. Dogs, cats, pigs, ducks, and chickens moved about like they owned the place, which, in a way, they did. The first dwelling we came to was 2 levels. The bottom open space, a rudimentary slat-board wall facing the street with a dirt floor. Inside housed a scooter, a couple of bicycles, laundry hanging in the dark to the rear, and a large, ancient, blackened stone brazier where an equally ancient large metal cauldron hung over the fire on wooden crossbeam supports, cooking breakfast for the family. Upstairs were the living quarters, the slats again, spaced apart, so it must have been quite cold and damp at night. Animals roamed about, checking us out and altering the neighborhood that those strange guys in robes were back. We stopped, waited, faced forward. The village exhaled around us. Then an elderly couple emerged with overfilled baskets, hand already pressed in Y. Their neighbors joined them. No announcements were made, nor doorbells chimed, and no cell phones rung, just a silent, understood rhythm. Sai Bat, the offering of food, of love, of memory. One by one, we received gifts of sticky rice, fried pork rinds, bottles of water, packages of ramen, bags of stew, all placed with quiet hands into our bowls. Then came a moment I hadn't expected. The couple crouched low on their haunches, uncapped small bottles, and began to pour water slowly onto the earth, while Luang P. Wat began to chant. I learned later it was a ritual for the dead, a blessing for departed loved ones. The water, symbolic of a life poured forth, or the watering of future abundance. It was a kind of gesture Tolkien might have tucked into a forced ritual among elves. Yet here it was, real, muddy, sacred. We chanted our awkward blessing, our taped cheat sheets trembling as shaky hands in the mist tried to hold steady through the solemnity of the moment. We sounded like a drunken choir of tone-deaf monks, but the villagers smiled, not in mockery, not in pity, but in a kind of warm-hearted understanding, as if they were saying, "You'll get it, in time." And I believed them. We continued, from primitive house to primitive house. Some gave, some didn't. All welcomed us. Even as families bustled with their mornings, cooking, tending livestock, ushering children to school, they made space for us in their rhythm. They had prepared for this. Woken early, cooked extra, waited in the rain. Not because they had extra to give, but because they wanted to. Always with smiles that reached into our hearts. The villagers obviously had no wealth that we Westerners would identify as such. Many of them had disfigured feet from a lifetime of toiling in fields with no shoes. The hard labor life of subsistence farming was evident in the lines mapping lives on faces, while the dirt under their nails looked like it belonged there. And yet their clothing was immaculate. clean, and pressed as they crouched at their driveways in the rain. What struck me most after the fourth or fifth house was the very real joy, the loving adoration and devotion that was evident in these people's eyes as they filled our bowls again and again with nourishment. I was taken aback. I was taken by surprise. I was flabbergasted. While some of the houses we stopped at were tidy and tightly built, some of them looked to be barely standing or to be able to withstand the slightest gust of wind. It was at those homes that the alms offerings seemed to be even more generous. Our drivers, who were quietly following in the trucks at a discreet distance, would come between our stops with larger bins to collect what had been given to us in our bowls. I suddenly became acutely aware, as if a brightly lit diamond shot into my forehead, that I felt ashamed. Ashamed of my assumptions and my complete lack of understanding of what it meant to be rich. My assumptions that these people were poor related entirely to my upbringing, my life, and the expectations of success and of what it meant to be wealthy in Western society. I was ashamed to think that these lives, these beautiful people, centered around an ancient stone brazier and a slat board hovel, where the comforts of material wealth were completely absent, that was poverty. I realized that my life, until recently, was an abomination of the human spirit. These people, living simply, were the richest, most soulful, beautiful human beings I had ever encountered. They wanted for nothing. They didn't need a fancy house or cars, a wine cellar with Rydell glasses, steak or lobster or foie gras served on hand painted Italian pottery to show their dinner guests how sophisticated they were. These seemingly simple people were wealthier in spirit and love, with a deep, soulful sophistication, than anyone I'd ever met. You could see it in their eyes, their smiles, that they were more comfortable in their skins and lives than we were. It was an epiphany unlike anything I'd learned before, and I was humbled to my very core. That singular experience has forever changed the way I look at humanity. The vanity of excess that I had lived, not seeing it as such, was suddenly ugly, bereft of the soulful happiness that I was witnessing. And in that moment, trudging along in our line of monks through a fog wrapped village perched on the bones of the mountains, I realized for the first time in a very long time, I wanted nothing. I just wanted to be worthy of the gift of being here. I felt light. As we wound our way down through the mountainside village, time after time, house after house, person after person gave with love, respect, and humility, supporting their local monastery, with the hope that those gifts of nourishment would see us through our journey. All they asked for in return was a simple blessing to see them through their journey, their day and week ahead. By the time we reached our final stop, a modest tea producer whose quiet generosity kept the monastery's tea tins full and steaming throughout the year, we were no longer the same monks who had climbed out of those trucks hours earlier. Everything had shifted. You could feel it in the way we held our bowls, in the softened focus of our eyes, in the slower, more deliberate rhythm of our steps and breath. We arrived that morning as newcomers, freshly minted bhikkhus, cloaked in wet robes and good intentions. But we left as men changed, not by theory or scripture, but by sticky rice, rain, and the radiant dignity of people who gave until it hurt and smiled anyways. This wasn't begging, not even close. This was the ancient heartbeat of mutual understanding, a sacred barter of need and nourishment. We offered presence, assistance, community, and blessings. They offered food, effort, and something less tangible, something that shimmered like the mist that clung to the ridgelines. Grace or love in a more elemental form. As we began loading up the trucks, my bowl lighter but my heart considerably fuller, the Wang Pi Fop caught my eye. His smile was a quiet lantern in the fog. He walked over to me, his steps unhurried, his robe swaying like the mist wrapped branches of a cypress in a gentle breeze. He placed a hand on my shoulder, not to steady me, but to anchor something between us. His eyes, ageless and amused, searched mine for a flicker of recognition, and when he found it, he nodded once. "Would you like to come with me on Tuesday?" he asked, the question soft but lit with purpose. "Smaller village, 3 or 4 monks." He already knew my answer, but I gave it to him anyway. I would be deeply honored. The ride back to the monastery was quiet. It had started to rain again shortly after our last blessing recitation. I got back in the truck, glad for the blanket I had brought with me in the early hours of cold that morning. I used it to wipe first my tears, then my feet. I came to the realization that at some point during the 30 some odd stops we had made at homes that I now looked up upon with fondness, that I had forgotten that I was barefoot, sidestepping hungry leeches, walking through rivulets of cold mountain rainwater on steep, muddy lanes. As I wiped my feet down and dried them off, I was about to put my thick, warm socks back on, then stopped, realizing I didn't need them anymore. The following Tuesday, I joined Luang, P. Fop, Emiliano, and Peter for alms rounds to a much smaller village, one that could generously be called a hamlet. Again, it was dark, barely heading into the first inklings of pale dawn. We'd been on the main track for about a mile when our driver veered up a very steep path, one that could charitably be described as a goat track if the goat was drunk and didn't mind landslides. There was no sign, no trailhead, no indication that human beings had any business up there at all. It was one of those roads where the jungle closed behind you as the entrance disappears the moment you take it, as if the mountain itself was swallowing you up to keep its secrets. We climbed slowly, steadily in the truck, and the tires slipping now and then in the soft red mud, and I realized this wasn't a village in the usual sense. This was going to be a speck of a community, maybe a dozen rustic houses and a spirit shrine. When we finally reached the end of the track, we stepped out and began walking along a narrow ridge, the air thinner, cleaner, and brighter than it had any right to be. You could feel the altitude in your chest and in your thoughts, both a little harder to hold on to. Before we reached the first house, Luang P. Fop stopped us. He gently took my shoulders in his hands and, with the grace of someone turning a dial to tune in a faint frequency, rotated me about 40 degrees. "Look," he said softly, his eyes already reflecting what I hadn't yet seen. There, across the wide, deep ravine, rising from a flat topped mountain like something conjured from Scripture, was a tree. Not just any tree, a colossus of the forest. It towered above every other living thing for miles. Gnarled and noble, its crown touched the waking sky, as the breadth of its canopy spread over everything else on that ridgetop, catching the first fire of morning. Blazing from behind like a golden halo, the sun began its climb, creating the theatrical backlighting that Nolan only dreamt of. A few wisps of mist curled around its massive trunk like they knew they didn't belong higher. It was the Tree of Souls, not just from Avatar, but from every story ever told where something ancient, sacred, and alive waited for you to notice it. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't swallow. I couldn't speak. "Amazing, isn't it?" Luang P. Fop said softly, his voice projecting a quiet and encompassing reverence. He sounded almost sorry, like he'd interrupted a prayer he didn't mean to overhear. I nodded, unable to answer, because something in me had profoundly shifted. That tree wasn't just a tree. It was a memory. It was history. It was power, and it owned the wisdom of ages. The grieving my soul had been tortured with was launched heart first into bas relief as I gazed upon its magnificence. Well, that hero of times past and present waited patiently across the ravine for all to understand. It had been there the whole time, through it all. I couldn't look away as I burst into tears.